Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third entry in my series covering this monster iceberg chart with hundreds of entries spread across 9 tiers, focusing on IndyCar as a whole, made by brazillianhuevolution on Reddit. And in this video, I will cover the third tier of this iceberg. You might notice that I did not cover some entries from this tier on the iceberg, and this is simply for the sake of time, as I like to put these videos out in a slightly timely manner. I have also rearranged some entries around from other tiers to put them in what I think is a more fitting place. Now, if you don't know what an iceberg chart is, I will have me, from the past video, do the honors because I am lazy. Now, if you don't know what an iceberg chart is, I'm lazy, and so I'll have me from the previous video explain it. Now, if by some reason you have not seen an iceberg chart or don't know what it represents, the topics nearest to the top are more well known, and as you go farther down, the more obscure and speculative they get, and at the very bottom, the most conspiratorial and disturbing facts reside. Now, with all necessities aside, time for the video. Tier 3, IndyCar YouTuber, Janet Guthrie. Over the history of American open-wheel motorsport, there have only been a few women who have been able to break through layers of financial difficulty and prejudice in a male-dominated sport to eke out some success in the most competitive motorsport series on Earth. And one of these drivers to not only compete, but also to achieve success in IndyCar is Janet Guthrie. Guthrie started her racing career in 1963 at the age of 25 racing sports cars, and she eventually started racing professionally, still in sports cars, later the decade, winning her class at the 12 Hours of Sebring twice in the early 70s. In 1976, Guthrie made the biggest step of her career, running part-time schedules in both the NASCAR Cup Series and IndyCar that year, gaining a best finish of 15th at the World 600 and the Summer Daytona race that year in NASCAR, and in IndyCar, she tried but failed to qualify for the Indy 500. The next year, in 1977, Guthrie competed in the Daytona 500, being the first woman to do so, in which she eventually finished 12th. She also tried, and succeeded, to qualify for the Indy 500 that year, in which she finished 29th, out after 27 laps with engine trouble. She continued making starts in both NASCAR and IndyCar the next few years, starting the 1978 Indy 500, getting her best ever IndyCar finish of 9th, and the 1979 Indy 500, in which she finished 34th, out after 3 laps with an engine issue. However, despite the success, she started her last IndyCar race in 1979 and her last NASCAR race in 1980 due to a lack of funding due to companies not wanting to sponsor a woman. However, her influence in motorsport didn't wane after her retirement, with her helping other female drivers to compete in the high level of motorsport and being inducted into the International Motorsport Hall of Fame in 2006. She is quite the notable driver in the history of IndyCar, with her able to persist through sexism in the largely male-dominated racing series to do what she loved. Willie T. Ribbs. On the theme of racing drivers breaking barriers to compete in the top level of motorsport, Willie T. Ribbs is a retired African-American racing driver who has competed in both IndyCar and NASCAR. Ribbs had been involved with racing from a young age, with his father racing amateurly and also being familiar with IndyCar driver Joe Leonard, as they happened to be neighbors. Ribbs started his racing career in Formula Ford at the age of 20, with him winning 2 championships in 1976 and 1977. He then made a one-off start in Formula Atlantic in 1978 at Long Beach, finishing 10th. He was then invited to drive for the World 600 the same year by Humpy Wheeler, president of the Charlotte Motor Speedway, the track that the World 600 was held at, with the team Cronkite Racing. However, he was rejected from racing by track officials due to a lack of stock car racing experience, and his seat was then taken by a young Dale Earnhardt. After a break from racing for a few years, Ribbs returned to racing with Formula Atlantic in 1981 and then debut in the Trans Am Series, winning 5 races his rookie year in 1982. Ribbs continued racing in the Trans Am Series for the next few years and attempted to qualify for the Indy 500 in 1985, but withdrawing due to running about 30 miles per hour under the average speed of other drivers. The next year, Ribbs made his first starts in NASCAR, running 4 races that year with DeGard Motorsports, with a best finish of 22nd coming at North Wilkesboro. In that same year, he became the first black person to drive a Formula One car when he tested for the Brabham team, in anticipation for him joining the team next year. But he unfortunately wasn't given the drive when the time came. In 1990 and in 1991, Ribbs drove in the kart series part-time, getting a best finish of 6th at the 1991 Denver race, and also in 1991, he became the first African American to qualify for the Indy 500, in which he finished 32nd, out after 5 laps with engine issues. He continued racing full-time in IndyCar for the 1993 season, making his second and final start in the Indy 500 that year, finishing 22nd, and he got a few top 10s during that time racing in the regular season. He then returned to the IndyCar series after a few years out in 1999 at the Las Vegas round that year for a one-off start, getting a last place 26th. Ribbs returned racing NASCAR in 2001, running a full-time season in the Truck Series that year with Bobby Hamilton Racing, gaining a best finish of 13th at Pikes Peak International Raceway. Ribbs hasn't competed much in motorsports since, with him making a one-off start in Indy Lights in 2011 at Baltimore and competing a full season in the Superstar Racing Experience in 2021. Despite not achieving too much success in top-level motorsport, Ribbs is notable for persevering through prejudice to race in NASCAR and IndyCar, and he has made his legacy because of it. Indy 505. The winner of the Indy 500 always completes 500 miles when the checkered flag falls, as is in the name, right? Well, the 1995 Indy 500 would prove that wrong. The race itself didn't start off without incident, as 11th place starter Stan Fox suffered a horrific crash in the first turn, in which he spun up the track into the wall, destroying most of his chassis in the process, and leaving his legs sticking out of the front of the car, which luckily wasn't fatal, as it had the potential to be if a few other things had went wrong. This caused a lengthy yellow flag period, and Arie Luyendyk took the green flag at the restart. On lap 37, Luyendyk tried to get past the slower car of Scott Sharp, but he felt frustrated as he thought Sharp was blocking him, and so he showed him the bird. This knocked off Luyendyk's headrest onto the track, causing a yellow flag due to debris. The safety car then went out to pick up the leader, Jacques Villeneuve, but Villeneuve didn't know he was leading, and so he passed the pace car 2 times before pitting, with the pace car trying to signal to Villeneuve that he was leader both times. Villeneuve was 3rd on the restart after pitting, but then was given a 2-lap penalty by race control for him passing the pace car, dropping him all the way down to 27th, 2 laps behind the leaders. But through a masterstroke combination of Villeneuve's driving and the great strategy calls of his team, he was able to make his way up to 2nd by the time a late race caution period was ending. The top 2 of Scott Goodyear and Villeneuve accelerated out of turn 4 for the restart, but Villeneuve lifted off before he was just about to pass the pace car, but Goodyear just blew right past it as it was entering the pits, taking the green flag well clear of everyone else. Goodyear was then issued a stop-go penalty for passing the pace car under yellow, but he refused to serve it in the last 10 laps, believing that he had done nothing wrong. Villeneuve then took the lead, leading the last few laps to his first Indy 500 victory, or Indy 505 victory, as 2 laps of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway are 5 miles, and Villeneuve came down from 2 laps down to win, doing an extra 5 miles than everyone else, and hence why the 1995 Indy 500 is nicknamed the Indy 505. Riding mechanics. The early days of racing were extremely different from today, especially that early Indy cars were not single-seaters. They held two people, the driver and the riding mechanic. The driver did the obvious job of driving the car around whatever death trap, board track, or speedway the series was racing at that day, but the riding mechanic served as the driver's assistant to keep the car running. Riding mechanics were ubiquitous across the early days of not only IndyCar, but also Grand Prix racing in Europe. The riding mechanic did many things, important not only to the operation of the car, as the name suggests, such as pumping fuel and oil, and monitoring gauges of aforementioned fluids, but also helped the driver as well. They served as a spotter for the drivers, as this was before rear-view mirror usage was regular, and communicating with the pits. Riding mechanics were utilized and were actually mandated by the sanctioning body AAA throughout the early days of American open wheel racing and the Indy 500 from the creation of both up until 1923. That year, they were made optional, in which most teams didn't utilize them, until 1930, in which they were made mandatory again, up until the break of racing during World War II. In the 1950s and beyond, riding mechanics were not utilized due to the increasing reliability and more widespread use of rear-view mirrors, making the mechanics obsolete, and also due to the fact that being a riding mechanic was extremely dangerous, with accidents often resulting in their death. Riding mechanics are a fascinating part of IndyCar history, but needless to say, it's probably for the better that they are left in the past. $6 ball bearing. In the 1967 Indy 500, Parnelli Jones, the 1963 500 winner, looks set to take his second Indy 500 crown, as with only 4 laps to go, he had a comfortable lead on second place A.J. Foyt. Jones had started 6th that day and had made an amazing pass at the first turn, in which he passed 4 cars in one corner, and then the next turn he passed pole sitter Mario Andretti to take the lead. He then dominated the rest of the race, only giving the lead to A.J. Foyt for 18 laps, but took back the lead for the last quarter, and on lap 186, a win seemed imminent. By the next lap, it all unraveled. On the backstretch, Jones's transmission failed. The culprit? A ball bearing, a measly small part of the transmission, only costing $6. This $6 ball bearing cost Jones's second Indy 500 win, but gifted one to A.J. Foyt, but not without incident. A.J. Foyt got through turn 4 of the final lap to take the checkered flag, but 4 cars then crashed on the straightaway, so Foyt had to weave through the carnage to take his third Indy 500 crown. Indianapolis 500 Evolution. Over the years, there have been quite the few games attempting to bring the thrill of IndyCar racing to the casual racing fan on their couch or their computer. These evolved from the simple Indy 500 for the Atari 2600, released in 1977, to the more simulation-aimed Indianapolis 500, the simulation, released for DOS systems in 1989, to the Papyrus-developed IndyCar racing games of the early 90s, to the Codemasters-developed IndyCar Series games of the mid-2000s, but the odd game out, due to the fact that focused on IndyCar historically, instead of the series contemporarily, is Indy 500 Evolution. The game included many historic tracks, such as the IMS over a period of many years, the Milwaukee Mile, among others, and a selection of scenarios to play through from the roadster days of the early 1960s to the rear-engined and downforce-heavy cars of the early 1970s. Unfortunately, the small budget and truncated development time prevailed over the historical accuracy to contribute to the game's poor reviews, such as an especially hilarious one from the official Xbox Magazine UK saying, "Their ambition is hamstruck by a development budget that would struggle to cover a 6-pack of crisps, and an engine that is best at simulating the midpoint of cataract formation." To date, this is the last game primarily focused on IndyCar, which is a shame, and with the motorsport game situation not getting any better, Indy 500 can be sure to retain that title for years to come. Hanford device. In the late 90s, the speeds for kart cars around superspeedways, tracks with distances of 2 miles or more, were getting quite ridiculous. When Mauricio Gugelmin lapsed the California Speedway to take pole position for the 1997 race, with an average speed of 240 miles per hour, it was obvious that something needed to be done to slow the cars down in order to make the races safer. The Hanford device was introduced to solve this problem. It attached the rear wing of the kart cars to increase drag and therefore slow down the cars. A side effect of this was the drafting effect was vastly amplified, making passing easier than usual, leading to some quite spectacular races. The 2001 Michigan 500 at Michigan International Speedway is a good example of the effect of the Hanford device. The race saw 60 lead changes between the top 11 drivers, and the finish came down to a pack of 5 cars going wheel to wheel for the win. Ed Carpenter eventually came away with the trophy, a textbook photo finish made possible by the Hanford device, which happened to be discontinued only a few years later due to karts rebranding into Champ Car and the shifting of focus into road and street courses. This idea of the Hanford device, or something simpler for today's cars returning, is an exciting one, as close racing is what we all want to see, but it might be rendered redundant due to the fact that Indy today only races at one superspeedway, the IMS, where the racing is already quite spectacular. Franchitti hitting airborne during the 2007 season. Airborne crashes in motorsport are something spectacular to watch, but an incident of the sort is extremely dangerous, especially in open wheel cars, where the driver is more exposed to the elements and anything that the car might collide with. And so it is probably for the best that these crashes are pretty rare, with only about one happening each season in today's IndyCar. But in 2007, the Indy 500 winner and the eventual champion that year, Dario Franchitti, had 2 spectacular flips in back-to-back races, no less, that he was lucky to walk away from. The first flip happened at that year's round at Michigan International Speedway on lap 143, where Franchitti was battling for the lead with the first place Dan Weldon. As the two entered the backstretch, they were side by side, but then Weldon checked up, colliding with Franchitti, sending him into the air, spinning around, before falling back to the track upside down, and the car of Thomas Scheckter slamming into the side of him, with Scott Dixon also being caught up in the melee. Amazingly, when the safety crew got Franchitti's car upright, he was alright, despite the top of his chassis being completely shredded. Franchitti then was able to race the next race at Kentucky Motor Speedway, in which he was able to get through the whole race without incident, until the cooldown lap, where Franchitti thought there was one more lap left, until he remained at full speed while the car of Kosuke Matsura slowed down directly in front of him. Franchitti had barely any time to react, and so he plowed into Matsura, being vaulted over the slower car and doing a full backflip in the air, thankfully orienting the right side up before the car slammed into the safer barrier. Franchitti was able to walk away from the second life-threatening crash in 2 races, no doubt leaving himself and many others in the disbelief, including the announcers whose remark summarizes this whole entry in just a few words.
Oh my gosh, he goes up and over again?
2015 aero kits causing airborne crashes. On the topic of flying IndyCars, for the 2015 IndyCar season, new aerodynamic parts were made available for teams to use, and this proved little problems for the first 5 races of the year, which were held on road courses. But for the 6th round of the year, the Indianapolis 500, problems started to present during practice for the race. Ilio Castroneves suffered a spectacular crash during practice when he went into turn 1 but got loose and hit the wall, and the aero kit caused him to do almost a full backflip before coming to rest in a broken car at the side of the track. The next airborne crash happened to Joseph Newgarden, in which he got loose at turn 1, spun into the wall, and did a pretty similar flip to Castroneves' the day before sliding on his side to a stop in the short chute infield. Another crash of the same sort happened to James Hinchcliffe, whose car flipped after he hit the wall and slid sideways down the track after a suspension failure, and also to Ed Carpenter as well. Thankfully, no airborne crashes happened during the race itself due to slower speeds for the setups the team used for the race. The most serious airborne crash during the season happened at the Fontana round that year, in which, with 2 laps to go, Juan Pablo Montoya touched the wheel of Ryan Hunter-Reay, sending him into the infield with Ryan Briscoe, whose car flipped, violently impacted the grass, sending him spinning and eventually resting right side up on the apron of the track. Briscoe was thankfully okay, returning to the track later to see his crash site and even lay down in the hole his nose had dug into the grass earlier that day. This was the end of airborne crashes that season, and for the next year, in 2016, changes were made to make these kinds of crashes less common, and nowadays, this was worked, with airborne crashes being a lot rarer. Tony Kanaan Porta-John incident. At the 2011 Indycar race at New Hampshire Motor Speedway, Tony Kanaan was running 10th, and on lap 111, he went out of turn 2, 3 wide, with Marco Andretti and Thomas Scheckter. Andretti clipped Schecter's wheel, causing him to spin out, collecting Kanaan in the process, and the two went out of control into the infield. After sliding through the grass for a bit, both slammed into the tire barrier, with Kanaan flipping over and knocking over Porta-John on the other side of the wall. Luckily, no one was in the port body, and later that race, Will Power's infamous middle finger moment. The race would be yellow flagged due to rain falling on the circuit with 19 laps to go, and the cars paraded around the safety car for 10 laps before race control thought the track was dry enough to green flag the race and finish it up, as there were only 9 laps remaining. This was a mistake, to say the least. As the cars went to take the green, Will Power got on his radio to say that the track was not dry enough to race on, and his remarks were affirmed when the drivers accelerated to take the restart, where Danica Patrick lost traction and spun due to the wet track and cold tires, and Will Power, trying to avoid her car, spun due to the wet track as well, hitting the wall and then being hit by the car of Ed Carpenter. Power then quickly got out of his car and was quick to voice his discontent. Power was furious at the officials due to the call to restart taking him out of the race, as he had a 20-point lead in the championship that surely was gone by now. He can be seen furiously talking to race officials, and when he sees himself on the big screen, he whips out a middle finger in each hand, a very direct FU to the race officials. Race control ended the race there, with only 6 laps to go, and the track still wet. It didn't make sense to wait the rain out, and the final standings were taken from the positions before the restart, giving Power his point lead back. It was all a moot point forever, as Power finished second in the championship to Dario Franchitti at the end of that year. Elio Castroneves' meltdown. On the topic of an extremely angry driver lashing out, on the 2010 IndyCar round at Edmonton, Elio Castroneves was not happy with race control, to say the least. Castroneves was leading at the time of a late race restart, with 3 laps left, and with Power in second, he had quite a job to fend him off. Castroneves defended aggressively, and as the two went into a more narrow section of the track, Castroneves came out in front, while Power was passed by Scott Dixon. Castroneves continued to lead, but then he was issued a drive-through penalty by race control for blocking Power, in which he had to serve in the last part of the race, which he didn't. As Castroneves crossed the line to take the checkered flag, the flagmen didn't wave it for him. They waved it for second place Scott Dixon instead. When Castroneves was informed he hadn't won, he was furious, screaming profanities, and not able to be calmed down by his mechanics, he stormed off into the grass, and eventually started shouting at some race personnel before being approached by 2 security guards, one of whom he grabbed, and started shouting in his face, before he was able to be calmed down. In a post-race interview, he voiced his discontent, saying that his win was taken away for a trivial reason, and his defending for power wasn't penalty-worthy, with many other fans and drivers sharing his opinion. 1964 Indy 500. In the opening laps of the 1964 Indy 500, pole sitter Jim Clark took off into the lead, while cars behind him fought for position. One of these midfield drivers, Dave McDonald, was driving a radically designed car with streamlined bodywork and the gas tanks being housed in the side pods, which made it fast but extremely difficult to handle. On the first lap, McDonald passed 5 cars, but was observed zigzagging and handling erratically, which Johnny Rutherford commented on, saying he's either going to win this thing or crash. On lap 2, McDonald spun off, going into the main straight, hitting the wall and erupting in an explosion of flames. His car then slid back on track, causing a crash in which Ronnie Derman, Bobby Unser, Chuck Stevenson, Norm Hall, and Eddie Sachs were caught up in. Sadly, Sachs and McDonald died in the accident, Sachs due to the impact when his car struck McDonald's, and McDonald due to smoke inhalation. The race was stopped after this, and in this period, Tom Carnegie, the PA announcer, issued the news that Sachs had passed away.
Driver Eddie Sachs was fatally injured in the accident on the main straightaway.
And Sid Collins, the Speedway's radio announcer, gave an impromptu eulogy, of which I will play now.
You heard the announcement from the public address system. There's not a sound. Men are taking off their hats. People are weeping. Over 300,000 fans here are not moving, disbelieving. Some men try to conquer life in a number of ways. These days of our outer space attempts, some men try to conquer the universe. Race drivers are courageous men who try to conquer life and death, and they calculate their risks. And in our talking with them over the years, I think we know their inner thoughts in regard to racing. They take it as a part of living. No one is moving on the racetrack. They're standing silently. A race driver who leaves this earth mentally when he straps himself into the cockpit to try for what to him is the biggest conquest he can make, is aware of the odds, and Eddie Sachs played the odds. He was serious and frivolous. He was fun. He was a wonderful gentleman. He took much needling and gave much needling. And just as the astronauts do, perhaps, these boys on the racetrack ask no quarter and they give none. If they succeed, they're a hero, and if they fail, they tried. And it was Eddie's desire, I'm sure, and will, to try with everything he had, which he always did. So the only healthy way perhaps we can approach the tragedy of the loss of a friend like Eddie Sachs is to know that he would have wanted us to face it as he did, as it has happened, not as we wish it would have happened. It is God's will, I'm sure, and we must accept that. We're all speeding toward death at the rate of 60 minutes every hour. The difference is that we don't know how to speed faster, and Eddie Sachs did. And so since death has 1,000 or more doors, Eddie Sachs exits this earth in a race car. Knowing Eddie, I assume that's the way he would have wanted it.
Al Sr.'s 1987 Indy 500 race car origins. On the surface, the 1987 Indy 500 seems quite conventional. Al Unser, a tried-and-true 500 driver, already a 3-time winner, won the race with the Penske team, an established IndyCar outfit. But the behind-the-scenes was anything but conventional. The driver who was supposed to drive the Indy 500 that year for Penske, Daniel Geis, crashed during practice, sustaining a concussion, unable to race, and so Roger Penske called up Unser to drive in his stead, in which he accepted. Unser didn't end up driving the PC-16 chassis that year, but instead an old March chassis, which wasn't in stock at the track at the time, so the team had to drive all the way to a Sheraton hotel in Reading, Pennsylvania to retrieve the chassis, which was a show car at the time. The team was able to get ready for racing in time, and it took Unser to his 4th Indy 500 crown, with the car that was sitting stationary in a hotel lobby not 1 month prior. 1996 IRL Co-Champions. The first season of the Indy Racing League was quite the peculiar one, to say the least. It was filled with many unknown drivers, as this was during the second IndyCar split, where top teams and drivers stayed in kart, and the minnows joined the IRL. There were only 3 rounds of the calendar, the initial plan to have the first season be a truncated one, starting in January and ending in May, and the subsequent ones to start in the fall of one year and to end at the Indy 500 the next year. This plan was scrapped eventually, leaving the IRL to contest 2 weird calendars with a short 1996 and a longer, more than a year long 1996 to 1997 calendar to bring the series in sync with the rest of the motor racing world. The 1996 season consisted of 3 events, starting at Walt Disney World Speedway in late January, then going to Phoenix in late March, and ending at the Indy 500 in late May. Only 15 drivers contested the full schedule, even with the incentive introduced to give runners of all 3 races 3 times the amount of points for their finishes than a single race entry would get. When the checkered flag flew for the 500 that year, to signal the end of the season, Buzz Calkins and Scott Sharp were equal on points. And in what must have been a massive oversight, the IRL had no tiebreaker rule in place. So even though Calkins had 1 win and Sharp had none, they were both declared the co-champions of the 1996 IRL season, bringing a weird end to a weird season of a weird racing series in what was quite the weird era of IndyCar. AJ Allmendinger's seatbelts cost him the 2013 Indy 500. For the 2013 IndyCar season, the former Champ Car turned NASCAR driver AJ Allmendinger announced his return to open wheel racing, where he would be running part-time for the Penske team that season in a schedule including the Indy 500. For Allmendinger's first races that season, he didn't go so well, earning a 19th place finish at Barber and a 23rd place finish at Long Beach, and it looked to be the same at the 500, with Allmendinger starting 5th but dropping to 15th on the 5th lap. But he fought back. Helped by adjustments to his car on pit road, he got in the lead by lap 99. After Allmendinger led for 11 laps, his seatbelts then, unfortunately, came loose, causing him to need to come to pit road to get them refastened, and losing quite a few positions in the process. Allmendinger did fight back to finish 7th in the end. Not a bad finish for a rookie, but considering he had a legitimate shot for the win, had his harness not come undone, it was an unwanted consolation prize. Carlos Huerta's retirement from IndyCar. Carlos Huertas was quite the anonymous IndyCar driver, being lost in the crowds of midfielders in the early 2010s, apart from one moment. That one moment happened during the 2014 season, in which Huerta ran anonymously in the lower midfield with Dale Coyne Racing until the first Houston race came along. During the race, Huertas was able to run longer stints than other cars, and this allowed him to get up front and to win his first IndyCar race. These extra long stints raised suspicion, and so the team was investigated and were found to have a larger than mandated fuel tank, and so the team and Huertas were then fined $5,000, but the win still stood. Huertas continued racing with Dale Coyne for 2016, albeit with a part-time schedule, but then withdrew from the 2016 Indy 500, citing an ear infection as the issue. He hasn't been seen in IndyCar since, and some reasons may be due to the fact that he was running out of funding and his racing career still out there. Also, later in the season, Huertas' former teammate, Justin Wilson, was killed in a crash, and so that might have contributed to Huertas distancing himself from racing, and those two reasons probably contributed to Huertas' sudden retirement from IndyCar. Methanol fires. Pit stop fires are always very dangerous, as when gasoline is spilled all over the pit box, there are plenty of sources able to ignite it and make a huge fire. But when methanol, a different type of fuel, is spilled and catches fire, the consequences could be much more grave. For quite a few years, in the 1970s and 1980s, many teams fueled their car with pure methanol, which, while better than the more conventionally used ethanol and gasoline, for its ability to allow engines and turbochargers to run cooler, had many safety risks, such that methanol fires are very dim and are pretty much invisible when viewed in direct sunlight. This can be seen in the 1981 Indy 500, where Rick Mears was pitting, but a methanol spill was then ignited by Tom Sneva's car backfiring, and Rick Mears and some of his crew were then covered by flames. The marshals with fire extinguishers couldn't see the flames, and so while the marshals sprayed down the car, they didn't spray down Mears and one of his mechanics, which were both on fire, so you can see Mears and one of his mechanics flying around while on fire, trying to get the attention of someone. They were eventually able to be extinguished, although only after a horrifying period of half a minute. After this, additives were mandated to be added into methanol to make sure a fire was visible, and incident like Mears's hasn't happened to date. Autonomous IndyCar. This entry on the iceberg relates to the autonomous race cars developed during the Indy Autonomous Challenge, a competition between various teams to develop software to pilot an Indy-like car around a certain track in the most safe and reliable way possible. The challenge is run in a 5-stage format, with the first one to submit a paper with the project outline, the second one to demonstrate the software, the third one a simulation race, the fourth one a qualifying session in which cars need to run over 100 miles per hour over a 10-lap average to qualify, and then the final stage, a 20-lap race between all cars which manage to qualify. The first round, held in 2021 at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, was won by a team from the Technical University of Munich. The second round, held in 2022 at the Las Vegas Motor Speedway, was then won by a team from the Milan Polytechnic University, and the third race in 2023 was then also won by the same team. But don't be too worried that your favorite drivers will be replaced by computers anytime soon, as if the failure of RoboRace has taught us anything, then this technology has a long time to go before it is human grade. Last row party. Qualifying on the last row for the Indy 500 is not exactly a thing to be proud about. However, every year since 1972, the drivers unfortunate enough to be in that unenvious position have found a way to have fun in it. The last row party is a scholarship benefit party organized by the Indianapolis Press Club Foundation, held the Friday before the 500 in celebration of the 31st, 32nd, and 33rd starters of the race. Along with the well-natured jokes aimed at the drivers, they are also presented of checks of 31, 32, and 33 cents for each driver in their starting position, and the drivers become known as part of the 11th Row Society. While not always the best position to be in the week prior for the 500, it's not the worst, as many drivers in the 11th Row Society have been rookies or drivers with midfield teams, barely able to survive the chaos of bump day, and are very happy just to start the 500, regardless of what position. Well, that concludes my coverage of the third tier of the Indycar Iceberg, and for those who are still paying attention, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.